She's out singing everybody, I think. Good to be here this evening, and glad some of us are making a joyful shout to the Lord as we sing. Among the ancient documents that detail much of the Egyptian medicinal knowledge, the Ebers Papyrus, which is pictured here on the screen, ranks as one of the foremost sources. This papyrus that you see here was discovered in 1872 by a German Egyptologist named George Ebers. That's why it's called the Ebers Papyrus. It consists, not just this papyrus, but there's a lot more to it. It consists of a host of medical remedies that are purported to heal, to enhance, and to prevent. Altogether, there's 811 prescriptions that are set forth in the papyrus, and they take the form of salves, of plasters, of snuffs, inhalations, gargles, draughts, confections and pills, fumigations, suppositories. I don't know how you sign that one. And enemas. just for fun. Yeah. Yeah. You can spell it out. This is what Britannica says about this. The Egyptian compilation, the Ebers Papyrus, is the Egyptian compilation of medical texts dated about 1550 BC. It's one of the oldest known medical works. The scroll contains 700 magical formulas and folk remedies meant to cure afflictions ranging from crocodile bite to toenail pain, and to rid the house of such pests as flies, of rats, and scorpions. It also includes a surprisingly accurate description of the circulatory system, noting the existence of blood vessels throughout the body and the heart's function as the center of the blood supply. And the Ebers Papyrus was acquired by George Ebers in 1873. The Egyptians were considered the best doctors of the ancient world. Massengill writes in a sketch of medicine and pharmacy, he says, Egypt was the medical center of the ancient world. We also read in the histories of Herodotus that in the days of the Medo-Persians, King Darius's practice was to keep in attendance certain Egyptian doctors who had a reputation for the highest eminence in their profession. However, I want to point out to you that not all Egyptians were always so wise. And not all of their prescriptions were always very wise, especially as we contrasted with the medical knowledge that we have today. Let me give you 3 examples. First of all, to draw out splinters. Among the hundreds of prescriptions, there are a lot of disgusting treatments that caused much more harm than good. And there's a section in the papyrus titled, What to Do to Draw Out Splinters in the Flesh. And the remedy prescribed consists of worm blood, mole blood, and donkey dung. Now, of course, doctors today realize that's probably not a good idea to apply to your broken wound. Dung is loaded with tetanus spores. Not a good idea. And a simple splinter, it's noted by Doctors McMillan and Stern, could often result in a gruesome death from lockjaw because of this prescription among the ancient Egyptian doctors. If you wanted to heal skin diseases, one of the remedies that was offered to help heal skin diseases included such prescriptions as a hog's tooth, cat's dung, dog's dung, the olive samu oil, berries of the zet plant. You pound all this together and you apply it. It's poultice. I'd rather just have bad skin. Again, not a good idea. Here's another one. To prevent hair growth. There's various other ingredients for the plethora of remedies concocted. Some of those ingredients for remedies included the dried excrement of a child, hog dung, and a farmer's urine. Here's a recipe to prevent hair growth that's found in the Ebers Papyrus among these very wise Egyptian doctors. It included lizard dung, the blood from a cow, from a donkey, a pig, a dog, and a stag. Obviously, that's not going to be recommended today. While it must be noted, and we've pulled out some of the crazier ones, so it needs to be noted that some of the Egyptian medicine actually did include prescriptions and remedies that could be helpful. The harmful remedies and ingredients cast a pretty sickening shadow of untrustworthiness over the entire Egyptian endeavor as viewed by the modern reader. This is what Massengill again says in a sketch of medicine and pharmacy. He says, the early Egyptian physicians made considerable use of drugs. Their drugs were of the kind usually found in early civilizations. A few effective remedies lost in a mass of substances of purely superstitious origin. They used opium, squill, and other vegetable substances, but also excrement and urine. It is said that the urine of a faithful wife was with them effective in the treatment of sore eyes. My eyes are fine. Thankfully. Needless to say, the modern day reader would not want to be a patient in an ancient Egyptian clinic. But some of these flawed medical practices of ancient Egypt, they lead us to consider a question. Was Moses, who was raised in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, was he influenced by the medical malpractice of these Egyptians in his writings? The first 5 books of the Old Testament, compiled and authored by Moses, admittedly are not devoted entirely to the enumeration of medical prescriptions. They are not ancient medical textbooks, but they do contain numerous regulations for sanitation, for quarantine, and other medical procedures that were to govern the daily lives of the Israelite nation. And interestingly, missing entirely from the pages of these writings are the harmful remedies and ingredients prescribed by other ancient civilizations, such as Egypt. The Pentateuch exhibits an understanding of germs and disease that much modern medicine did not grasp for 3,500 years after the books were written. Now, Moses had been trained under the most advanced Egyptian educational system of his day. And with such training, it would have been only natural for Moses to include some of the Egyptian wisdom in his writings if he were comprising the Pentateuch by using his own prowess and his own mental faculties. But if you look into the medical practices from ancient Egypt and those found in the Pentateuch, it reveals that Moses did not necessarily rely on the wisdom of the Egyptians, which, as we've noted, in many cases consisted of life-threatening malpractice. Some medical practices in the Pentateuch are similar to those found in ancient Egyptian documents. And the Pentateuch, and when I say Pentateuch, I'm talking about the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the 5 books that Moses wrote. Those first 5 books exhibit a conspicuous absence of those harmful malpractices that plagued the writings of the Egyptians. What we instead find is that Moses penned the most advanced, flawless medical prescriptions that had ever been recorded, and every statement that pertained to the health and the medical well-being of the Israelite nation recorded by Moses could still be theoretically implemented and be completely in accord with every fact modern medicine has learned in regard to germ spreading, epidemic disease control, sanitation, and a host of other medical and scientific discoveries. So this is an evidence worth noting and studying as we contrast the all-wise God with the wise but fallible Egyptians. So what we want to do here today is we just want to note the medical foreknowledge of God, which I believe is an evidence of Mosaic inspiration. The fact that God was working through Moses as he wrote down what he did. And I want to consider the evidence for inspiration that exists as we think about the medical foreknowledge of God in several areas. Let's think first of all about Moses and what he says about the importance of blood. We understand today that blood is the liquid of life. Blood helps circulate the proteins and the oxygen that the body needs to survive. The hemoglobin that is found in red blood cells, it transports oxygen to the brain. If you don't have oxygen being transported to your brain, your body cannot function. So without hemoglobin, the body doesn't function. It took a while, though, for man to figure out the importance of blood. Man didn't always realize how important blood was. For example, it was believed in the Middle Ages, up until about the 19th century, that blood contained evil vapors. And because of the ignorance of blood's value, there were some learned people who did some tragic things with blood. For example, leeches were sometimes applied to those with fevers, hoping the leeches would draw out some of those evil vapors that were supposedly in the blood. Bloodletting was also a common practice at barbershops. Now, why would you do bloodletting at a barbershop? Well, because when they gave you a good shave, they had a nice sharp razor, right? Do you know why the barbershop symbol is this? It's because at ancient in many barbershops, they did the practice of bloodletting, and the red here symbolizes drawing your blood. So they would take they would take your arm, and they would take the veins and the arteries located just above the elbow, and they would open them, and the patient's arms were bled to expunge what they believed was the contaminated blood. George Washington, first president of the United States, died because of this type of misplaced medical zeal. There was an eyewitness account of Washington's death that related he came down with a chill, and in an effort to cure him, those who attended him resorted to bleeding. A vein was opened, we read, in the death of George Washington, but no relief was afforded, and eventually Washington dies simply because he probably bled to death. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't kill our first president. This is why, again, barbershops use this symbol. In the U.S., there's often a red, white, and blue symbol that's used. The blue probably got thrown in there because we're in the United States. But in most other countries, it's just a red and a white, which symbolizes the flow of blood, because barbershops was where this was done. But until 1900, this practice was a medical practice performed to rid the body of disease. And in some cases, bleeding a patient killed the patient because it alters temperature control, it alters waste removal, it alters the transportation of food and water. And so those razors were used for other things besides just a clean shave back in the day. But this was a common practice. And yet, thousands of years before the lethal practice of bloodletting was conceived, mankind had been informed by God that blood was the key to life. In Leviticus chapter 17 and verse 11, it says, "The life of the flesh is in the blood." Now today, we understand, because we know a lot more about blood, we understand completely the truthfulness of Moses' statement. The life of the flesh is in the blood. It says later in Leviticus 17 and verse 14 that the life of every creature is in the blood. We understand the importance of blood to life, both animal life and human life. But how did an ancient shepherd like Moses come to know this type of information? Was that just a lucky guess? How could Moses have known almost 3,500 years ago that life was in the blood, and it took the rest of the scientific and medical community thousands of years and thousands of lives to grasp this truth? I think the Old Testament's conspicuous failure to institute improper medical procedures as it related to blood speaks loudly of its medical accuracy. And so there's one example of the medical foreknowledge. Let me notice another one with you here. In this book, and I'd recommend this book, it has a lot more information than I have time to cover in today's lesson. But it's a book titled None of These Diseases, written by two doctors, Macmillan and Stern. They discuss how many of the hygienic rules established by God for the children of Israel still are applicable today. And as they're illustrating their point, they recount the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. Now, Semmelweis lived in the 1800s, and in 1847, he was the director of a hospital ward in Vienna, Austria. There are a lot of pregnant women who checked into his ward. He was an obstetrician. But 18% of the women who checked into his ward, they never checked out. 1 out of every 6 women that received treatment in that ward die of labor fever. Autopsies, when they performed autopsies, it revealed pus under their skin, in their chest cavities, in their eye sockets. In Semmelweis, he was distraught over the mortality rate in his ward. In other hospital wards, like it all over Europe, Newland noted that Australia, the Americas, Britain, Ireland, practically every other nation that had established a hospital suffered a similar mortality rate. 1 out of 6 would die. If a woman delivered a baby using a midwife, the death fell to about 3%. But if she chose to use the most advanced medical knowledge and facilities of her day, her chance of dying skyrocketed immensely. So here's Semmelweis. He's a doctor. He wants to fix the problem, and he tries to curb the carnage. So he would do different things to try to figure out what the problem was. He turned all the women on their sides, hoping that if they laid on their sides, the death rate would drop, but there was no change. He thought maybe the bell that the priest rang late in the evenings was scaring the women. And so he made the priest enter silently, and yet there was no drop in the death rates. As he contemplated the dilemma, he watched young medical students perform their routine tasks. And each day he noticed something. These students would perform autopsies on the dead mothers. Then they would rinse their hands in a bowl of bloody water. They would wipe them off on a common shared towel. And immediately they would begin internal examinations of these still living women. Catching on the problem here? Obvious to us, right? Wash your hands, dude. They didn't know that concept of germs, those little microscopic things that we know all about now. Not anything that they really understood at that time. Newland commented concerning the practice. He says, because there seemed no reason for them to wash their hands, except superficially, or change their clothing before coming to the first division, they did neither. Now here we are, we're 21st century observers, and obviously as we look back at this, we're appalled to think that such practices took place in institutes that was, at that time, considered the places of modern technology. I mean, what doctor today, in his right mind, would touch a dead person, perform an autopsy, and then go in and touch the inside of a woman who's about to give birth? Without first employing some type of hygienic practice that was intended to kill germs. But to Europeans living in the middle 19th century, that wasn't that long ago, germs were virtually a foreign concept. They'd never seen a germ, much less been able to predict its destructive potential. And according to a lot of their most prevalent theories, disease was caused by atmospheric conditions, cosmic influences. Those were some of the guesses of scientists at that time. So what does Semmelweis do? He ordered everyone in his ward to wash his or hands thoroughly in a chlorine solution after every examination. And in 3 months, you know what happened? The death rate went from 18% to 1%. Semmelweis had made an amazing discovery. It says here, Ignaz Semmelweis is remembered for the now commonplace notion that doctors must wash their hands before examining patients. In mid-19th century Vienna, this was a subversive idea. With deaths from childbed fever exploding, Semmelweis discovered that doctors themselves were spreading the disease. Obvious to us, right? But apparently not obvious to others. And so, why do we wash our hands today? We wash our hands today because we understand germs. But you know what? Semmelweis didn't really make a groundbreaking discovery, because he was really rediscovering what had been known in some circles for many years. Almost 3,300 years before Semmelweis lived, Moses had written this in Numbers chapter 19, verses 11 and 12. He who touches the dead body of anyone shall be unclean 7 days. He shall purify himself with the water on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day, then he will be clean. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd day, on the 7th day, he will not be clean. Touch a dead body, you're unclean. How did Moses know that? Germs were no new discovery in 1847. I think the biblical text recorded measures to check their spread as far back as approximately 1500 BC. Because God certainly knew about how disease was spread. And that's why he put those laws in there for the people and the protection of the people of Israel. Now, remember that water that was mentioned there in Numbers chapter 19? So the priest had to go wash with water on the 3rd day, and then he had to wash with the water again on the 7th day in order to be purified. I want you to think about that water. That water is mentioned in Numbers chapter 19. You're going to find some more information there about the water of purification that was to be used if someone had touched a dead body and was pronounced unclean. This is what you read in verses 5 through 9 of Numbers chapter 19. At first you're going to think, well, that's crazy. But stay with me. Numbers 19 verse 5, it says, the heifer, here they're going to get a red heifer, the heifer shall be burned in his sight, its hide, its flesh, its blood, its offal shall be burned. The priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet and cast them into the midst of the fire, burning the heifer. Notice there's 4 ingredients here. You've got the heifer being burnt. You have cedar wood, you have hyssop, and you have scarlet. And the priest shall wash his clothes, he shall bathe in water, and afterward he shall come into the camp. The priest shall be unclean until evening. Why? Because he's touched a dead heifer, so he was unclean. But he was making the water of purification. The one who burns it shall wash his clothes in water. Why? Because when you've killed an animal, you've touched the germs. and you're trying to be sanitary, so you're supposed to wash and you're supposed to burn your clothes, bathe in water, and you'll be unclean until evening. Then a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and store them outside the camp in a clean place. They shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel for the water of purification. It is for purifying from sin. So notice, here's this water of purification, and later in Numbers 19, that's what they were to use to wash with. This water of purification consisted of these, was to be filtered essentially through these 4 ingredients. Now, while some aspects of Jewish worship and practices were looking ahead to Jesus Christ, for example, killing a lamb was looking ahead to Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God, who was sacrificed for the sins of the world. There's not a medical reason behind that. There was a foreshadowing reason behind that. It is true, though, that some of the things we read about and the rituals that we read about had a medical purpose, which tells us something of the divine intellect behind the commands. I want you to notice the contents of the water of purification. At first glance, the water of purification just sounds like a hodgepodge of superstitious potion making that included this ashes of a red heifer and hyssop, cedarwood, and scarlet. But this formula was the farthest thing from a symbolic potion intended to ward off evil spirits. The recipe for the water of purification stands today as a wonderful example of the Bible's brilliance, because the recipe is nothing less than a procedure to produce an antibacterial soap. We take the making of an antibacterial soap kind of for granted because we just go to the store and we pick one up. You know, it wasn't too long ago people had to make their own soap. How do they do that? And what do they use to make their own soap? If we look at the ingredients individually of this water of purification, we're going to begin to see the value of each ingredient. First of all, you consider the ashes of a red heifer and the cedar. Now, most school kids know the pioneers in this country couldn't go to the nearest supermarket. They couldn't buy their favorite personal hygiene products. The only time our kids ever really learn about that is when they go to Conner Prairie or Kokomo, and they learn about how the old pioneers used to make soap and candles and things like that. Now, I think it's important for us so that we can wrap our head around this culture as well, not just the early pioneers in the U.S. If people wanted soap or shampoo back in the day, they made it themselves. Didn't have Pert Plus commercials. And they couldn't go to the store and just go get some. Now, one of the most oft-produced types of soap is lye soap, right? For the lye soap? All right. Practically anybody today can easily obtain a recipe for lye soap. Just use a quick search on the internet. I use a quick search on the internet, and here is a recipe about making soap from wood ash lye. What did they use to make lye soap? Wood ash. In many cases. There's different recipes, but one of the ways you made lye soap was you used wood ash. Now, the various lye soap recipes reveal that to obtain lye, here's what you do. You take water, you pour water through the ashes. The water retrieved from pouring it through the ashes contains a concentration of lye. Now, lye, in high concentration, it's caustic, it's irritating to the skin. It's one of the main ingredients in many modern chemical mixtures to unclog drains. In more diluted concentrations, it can be used as a really good exfoliant and a cleansing agent. Many companies today, they're still producing lye soap, but amazingly, Moses instructed the Israelites to prepare a mixture that would have included lye mixed in a diluted solution. Now, one of the other ingredients in the water of purification was cedar wood. You guys heard of the whole essential oils thing that's pretty popular today? It's pretty popular in Moses' day, too. Cedar wood is one of those essential oils that people talk about. You may think that's a bunch of hocus pocus, but it wasn't a bunch of hocus pocus when Moses was using cedar wood. There were beneficial properties of cedar wood. The oil from the cedar wood in the mixture most likely maintained numerous properties. There's a website that deals with various essential oils. Here's what they note. Cedar wood has long been used for storage cabinets because of its ability to repel insects and prevent decay. The home that I grew up in Indianapolis, we used to have a cedar closet. And it was completely cedar, walls, ceiling, everything. And we kept all the old clothes in there. There's probably still a ton of clothes in there. And you never had any bug problems in there because cedar repels bugs, insects. Never had any moths flying around in there. But cedar wood, it's long been used because of its ability to repel insects and to prevent decay. In oil form, when it's applied to humans, it's an antiseptic, it's an astringent, and it's an expectorant. It removes mucus from the respiratory systems. It's antifungal, it's a sedative, and it's an insecticide, according to Spa Essential Oils. There's another site, more specifically dealing with the beneficial properties of cedar. They explain the cedar leaves and twigs, they're rich in vitamin C, and it was their effectiveness in preventing or treating scurvy that led to the trees being called arbor vitae, or tree of life. In addition, there's recent research that's shown that extracts prepared from oriental cedar do in fact have antiviral, anti-inflammatory, and antibacterial properties. Recently, there was a group of German researchers that reported in 2002 that an extract prepared from cedar leaf, alcohol, and water inhibits the reproduction of influenza virus type A. While a team of researchers in Japan found an extract of western red cedar was effective in treating eczema. Now, some may wonder how you could have cedarwood oil if the wood was being burnt, but the oils are still in the ashes. For example, did you know, I had to learn this the hard way, but did you know that you can still get poison ivy from inhaling the smoke from burning poison ivy? Because the oils are still in the ashes and still in the smoke, right? Oils would still be in the burnt cedar wood. So you'd still get those positive results from it. Cedarwood oil then would have still been effective through the ashes, and this is something that we're only recently realizing. So it's interesting to know this information about the beneficial properties of the ingredients, such as cedar, hyssop, and lye, and the water of purification, is not coming from Bible-based sources. Most of it's simply coming from studies that have been done through cosmetic and therapeutic research. And they're beginning to note the positive properties of these oils. Well, here's another oil that gets used. It's hyssop oil. I feel like an advertisement for an essential oils party. But I want you to consider hyssop was also added to the water of purification. Now, hyssop contains the antiseptic thymol. That's the same ingredient that we find today in some brands of mouthwash. Hyssop oil continues to be a popular healing oil, and it's actually very expensive. In listing the benefits of hyssop, one site noted that it was once used for purifying temples and cleansing lepers. The leaves contain an antiseptic, antiviral oil. It's a mold that produces penicillin, grows on the leaves. An infusion is taken as a sedative, expectorant for flu, bronchitis, and phlegm. So you have the ashes of this red heifer, you have the ashes of cedar wood and hyssop being used to make this soap, or this water, essentially, that's antibacterial for people who had touched dead bodies and germs. Now, you might wonder, well, where's the scarlet come from? What's the point of the scarlet yarn that's supposed to be thrown into this as well? So finally, the Israelites were to toss into the mix scarlet, which was most likely a scarlet wool. I was reading a couple versions that say scarlet yarn in there. But adding wool fibers to the concoction would have made the mixture the ancient equivalent of lava soap. Thousands of years then before any formal studies were done to see what type of cleaning methods were the most effective, millennia before American pioneers concocted their lye solutions, ages before our most advanced medical students knew a thing about germ theory, Moses instructs the Israelites to concoct an amazingly effective recipe for soap that, if used properly in medical facilities like hospitals in Vienna, would literally have saved thousands of lives. Yet some people read that and they think, well, that's that water of purification. That's just a bunch of junk. What's that all about? I don't get why they would have told them to do that. Take a look at the properties of all of those things combined together and consider it. It's an antibacterial soap. That's what he was making for the water of purification. That's impressive. How did Moses know that? A couple more things. Recently, when Ebola was spreading through Africa and there was a risk that it was going to hit the United States, the subject of quarantine was a pretty hot topic just a few months ago, right? Many were demanding that anybody who had possibly been in contact with a person suffering Ebola be quarantined for a period of time to avoid an outbreak or to avoid an epidemic. And the reason why is it's obvious, because we realize that germs can be spread through spit, through a sneeze, through blood, through sweat. They can be passed through the air. So one of the best ways to avoid getting infected with a disease is to avoid any physical contact with another person, to isolate the sick person. Quarantining, it's not a new idea. If it had been used in certain ages and certain periods when there were epidemics and outbreaks of certain deadly diseases, it would have saved thousands of lives. It's an idea which Moses taught long ago, and he was ahead of his time. But it's quite amazing to see these practices in play when an understanding of microscopic germs was unknown to the ancient world. Take a look at Leviticus 13, verse 45. It says, "The leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn, and his head bare. He shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean." Now you read that and you think, what's that about covering the mustache? Kind of a weird command. What are you doing when you're covering your mustache? Covering your mouth. What do we tell our kids to do when they're coughing? Cover your mouth. You're spraying germs on people. Why was he told to cover his mustache when he was crying out, yelling? What happens when you yell out, unclean, unclean? Spit is flying out of your mouth. Cover your mouth and cry out, unclean, unclean. It says he shall be unclean. What's he supposed to do? Well, he needs to let people know, because that's the right thing to do. You're sick. You have a disease that can infect and afflict other people. So you need to do the right thing. Stay away from people and let them know if you're sick so they can stay away from you. Verse 46 says, he shall be unclean, and all the days he has the sore, he shall be unclean. He is unclean. He shall dwell alone. His dwelling should be outside the camp. He's quarantined. This is quarantine. Concerning such quarantine practices, Massengill wrote in his book, A Sketch of Medicine and Pharmacy, he says, in the prevention of disease, however, the ancient Hebrews made real progress. The teachings of Moses, as embodied in the priestly code of the Old Testament, contain two clear conceptions of modern sanitation: the importance of cleanliness and the possibility of controlling epidemic disease by isolation and quarantine. In the Encyclopedia of Medical History, written in 1985, they write this: the idea of contagion was foreign to the classic medical tradition and found no place in the voluminous Hippocratic writings. The Old Testament, however, is a rich source for contagionist sentiment, especially in regard to leprosy and venereal disease. In regard, then, to the understanding of contagion, we read that the Old Testament was ahead of its time, and there was no parallel to what the Old Testament was teaching about quarantine, separation, and sanitation. So here again, the Old Testament exhibits amazingly accurate medical knowledge that surpasses any known human ingenuity available at the time of its writing. Let's look at one more thing, and we could look at a lot more things, but this is the last one I want to look at. with you. Circumcision's a hot topic today. I don't know if you get into that over the water cooler at work or anything, but what it actually is a pretty hot topic. You can turn on your PBS station, and sometimes they're debating that, and people discuss this. I remember when I was an English teacher, and when I was student teaching, I remember our kids in the 12th grade had to do a research paper, and I'm telling you, I had 4 or 5 papers on the female circumcision that's taking place in some countries, the genital mutilation that's taking place in other countries. It was, for some, I hadn't even barely heard of it when I was student teaching, but I had a lot of kids that wanted to write about it. It's a hot topic. A lot of people use this topic. They use what the Bible teaches about circumcision to say, well, this just proves God is cruel. Why would he require someone to circumcise their child? The terms that are used to try to bias the issue would be to allow genital mutilation. That's the word that's used instead of circumcision sometimes. Well, certainly in the book of Genesis, the text relates that God chose Abraham and his descendants to be a special people who were set apart from all other nations. And the covenant that God made with Abraham included a physical sign that was to be implemented in all future generations of Abraham's descendants. In Genesis 17, this is what you read in verse 12, that he who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male child in your generations. So the Bible never commands female circumcision, by the way, just for the males. Every male child in your generations, he who is born in your house or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. He who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money must be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. The uncircumcised male child who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Here's a parade, and here's some of the signs that are being held up in a parade. This is apparently, I guess they have parades about these things. The covenant with Abraham and his offspring was to be marked in the flesh of every male child. And the practice of circumcision, it's a pretty hot topic. But there's some interesting medical research out there about the medical benefits of circumcision. Pediatrician Deborah Greenbaum, for example, noted 2 positive results of circumcision in studies that have been done on the issue. One of those is that some studies indicate 10 to 20 times, there are 10 to 20 times more urinary tract infections, that's UTIs, in uncircumcised boys than circumcised. It's also noted, she also noted, second result of failing to circumcise is that STDs are passed more readily among uncircumcised men. Here's another interesting tidbit or fact. This is by Brian Morris, and Brian Morris writes with an evolutionary bias, so he's not trying to defend the Bible, and he's just simply writing from a medical standpoint without trying to take any religious perspective into it. But he notes that penile cancer occurs almost entirely in uncircumcised men. Again, maybe there's some benefits of circumcision. Neonatal circumcision virtually abolishes the risk of that type of cancer. Not only could we note a litany of health benefits to encourage the practice of infant circumcision, which, by the way, under the new covenant is not mandatory. But certainly, I think we can see a few medical reasons behind why it was recommended by God. But you also notice in the Old Testament, the day on which the biblical record commands the practice to be implemented is of extreme importance as well. It was on day 8. Remember that? We just read it. But on day 8, they were to circumcise the male child who was born from Israel. Holt Pediatrics remains today one of the most influential works ever written about child care, about pediatric disease and other health concerns as they relate to children. This was first written in 1896 by Emmett Holt Jr., and it's gone through several revisions until the year 1953. This is a 1,500-page work. It's a master compilation of the modern medicine of its day. But one section, which starts on page 125 of the 12th edition, it's titled Hemorrhagic Disease of the Newborn. And the information included in the section details the occurrence of occasional spontaneous bleeding among newborns that can sometimes cause severe damage to major organs such as the brain and even death. And in the discussion pertaining to the reasons for such bleeding, the authors note that the excessive bleeding is primarily caused by a decreased level of prothrombin, which in turn is caused by insufficient levels of vitamin K. And the text notes that children's susceptibility is peculiar between the 2nd and the 5th days of life. So in chart form, we've got a chart here just to take a look at it. Holt Pediatrics illustrates that the percent of available prothrombin in a newborn dips from about 90% on its day of birth. This is day 1, the day of birth. Prothrombin is about 90%, and for days 2 through 5, it dips to about 35% on its 3rd day of life outside of the womb. After the 3rd day, though, the available prothrombin begins to climb, and that's what we see here. After the 3rd day, as they've studied these children, the levels of prothrombin begin to climb, and by the 8th day of the child's life, the available prothrombin level is approximately 110% of normal. That's about 20% higher than it was on the 1st day of the child's life. It's about 10% more than it will be during the rest of the child's life. And so such data proves the 8th day is the perfect day on which to perform a major surgery such as circumcision, because the ability for the blood to clot when these prothrombin levels are high is much higher. It's safer for the child than if you were to circumcise a child on days 2 through 5 when those levels are low. Now, how did Moses know such detailed data about newborn hemorrhaging? I think such amazing medical accuracy cannot be accounted for on the basis of human ingenuity in the ancient world. The fact that the entire Old Testament contains medical practices that would still be useful in 3rd world countries without a hint of error in regard to a single prescription indicates to us that divine oversight has to be the only reasonable answer, and that there is a God behind the writings of Moses and the writings of Scripture. Entire books could be written on the Old Testament's amazing medical accuracy. In our lesson today, we could have also touched upon some of the dietary restrictions such as the Jews, such as the unclean meats they were to avoid. God instructed the Jews to avoid eating reptiles, bats, unclean fish, unclean birds, and pork. There are a lot of studies that could be cited to point out the wisdom of these instructions, and that these unclean animals commonly carry more diseases such as salmonella, which is often carried by reptiles. Rabies are often carried by bats. Trichinosis is often passed through the consumption of ill-prepared pork. And there are certain fish that are toxic, such as blowfish. And there's undetectable disease in unclean foods such as oysters. All those things the Jews were not supposed to be eating. We need to put together another lesson entirely to cover all those laws of food consumption, but many studies have proven the wisdom of these practices, which help us understand it wasn't just some arbitrary and random choice of God as to why certain meats were to be avoided and certain meats were allowable. Medical doctors McMillan and Stern, they've written a book covering much of this material in their extremely interesting volume, None of These Diseases. And many physicians who have compared Moses' medical instructions to effective modern methods have come to realize the astonishing value and insight of the Old Testament text. Dr. Mott once wrote, he said, "Every word in the Hebrew Scriptures is well chosen and carries valuable knowledge and deep significance. and such is certainly the case in regard to the medical practices listed in its pages. Indeed, the accurate medical practices prescribed thousands of years before their significance was completely understood provides excellent evidence for the divine inspiration of the Bible. If God was right, and here's the real point here, not just to teach you about medicine and things of that nature. The real point is this: if God was right about helping us avoid the dangers which could afflict the physical man, then what about those dangers that will most certainly afflict and condemn the spiritual man? This study's not just an interesting exercise to see how God knows more about the medical field than we do. It's to remind us that God knows our hearts better than anyone and knows what is best for our lives, too. It would have been foolish for an Israelite to have ignored God's instructions, and I'm sure that there's Israelites who have died, and certainly many people over the years have died because they ignored some of these very basic practices which were for the health and the well-being. But friends, it's an awful and a terrible thing to ignore the instructions and the commands of an all-wise God who has your best interests at heart and who wants to save your soul. So if you're ignoring His will and you're ignoring His commands, I would beg you to change your mind, to realize the power and the might and the knowledge of God, and to humbly submit yourself to it. To realize He knows you, He knows what's best for your life, and if you've been walking in your own self-willed way, doing what you want without respect to the Father's will, you need to repent and you need to change. You need to come to Jesus Christ, who offers to forgive you of all those past sins that you've committed in your rebellion. You need to be baptized into Jesus Christ so your sins might be washed away and so you might start a new life. And we offer to you that opportunity tonight. If you just come forward while we stand and while we sing.